Hi, my name is Keith Cooper, Northlight Images, and in this video I'm going to address a question I was asked again recently about how many inks you need, different inks, paper types, how different inks in printers match up with different papers, how they affect the results, and why sometimes a paper may work well with an ink set or a paper may not work well with an ink set. Now, I'll leave the how many inks till a bit later because that's another question. But first up, a quick basic. In ordinary photo printers, what sorts of inks you've got? You've got two basic sorts. You've got pigment inks and you've got dye inks. Now, pigment inks are very fine ground up particles of pigment which are suspended in liquid, which are sprayed onto the little droplets, sprayed onto the paper, and that's the basics of an inkjet printer. With the dye inks, the pigments are dissolved in a solvent usually, and it's water-based in printers like this. Most Epson Canon printers, certainly, commercial ones may use solvents, different solvents, but for anything you're likely to come across in normal use is going to be aqueous or water-based. So you've got dyes. They will have other chemicals and things in with them that affect the performance, but in general there is dyes and there's pigments. Now, pigments get a bit of reputation as being the choice for professional use. Well, yes, they tend to last longer. The colours may not on some papers have quite the punch you can get with dyes, but they're more permanent, they last. Certainly if you're doing archival printing, then you want to consider using pigment inks. So in general, they're considered pro level. Now, I'm always very wary of using the term professional level because it means, it's a marketing term, means whatever you want it to mean. Certainly in selling something, if it's a pro product, it means whatever you want or the marketing people would like you to believe. But some of the downsides of pigment inks are that they sit on the surface of the paper. Now that can mean, and this is a pigment ink print, I can't even remember which printer this is. I think this was done on a large Canon printer. Makes not a lot of difference. Canon Epson are very similar in this respect. A lot comes down to paper choice and profiling. Now I've done lots of stuff on profiling and how it works, why it works and that, but it is very difficult normally for me to look at a print that I've done during my testing and say, yes, definitely that was done on an Epson printer or it was done on a Canon printer. The differences, as they get better and better, the differences become much more difficult to spot. But this one I can see, because where I've got it here, I can see light reflecting off the surface, and I can see that where there are light parts of the image, it's an architectural photo, one I did of a cricket pavilion that was designed years ago by one of our architectural clients. And if I look very carefully, I can see that it has a certain sheen to it, but where the lights are on the print, I can see it's slightly less shiny, and that's because the paper itself is slightly, and this is a luster finish of some sort, the paper itself is slightly less shiny than the inks. So that means that where there is white on the picture, i.e. no ink, you get a slight gloss differential, and you can see it, but that's only if you look very carefully at it. If you don't want that, then you generally have to print with dye inks or coat the papers or something like that, but I wouldn't do that. Nobody ever notices this. I've never had an architectural client look at an image, whether it be this size or one of the big ones like that, and look at it and go, those highlights look a little bit off. I can see the paper reflect. Nobody looks at that. As people doing printing, yeah, we do. But people looking at your photos, they see what it's about. They're far more likely to notice that one or two of the light bulbs on here have blown than they are to notice anything like that about the print quality. It doesn't make that much difference to most people. So that's pigment. That can be an issue. Dyes, and once again, here we have one that's printed with dye inks, and here, well, yeah, it looks pretty good. I can see a little bit of gloss differential in this, which then reminds me that I probably printed this one here on this particular print here. This is Epson ET8500, and I know that on some papers, some of the blacks that give a slight gloss difference, but this is being ultra picky. You don't really need to it. So the essence of it is there are two types of inks. There are mixed inks, such as this one here. One of the reasons why I looked at this particular picture here, because this one has a pigment black and a matte and a photo black in it. That's because the inks here, they can be optimized for different types of paper. If you try printing with the matte black ink on a glossy paper, the ink will not only look quite different, it will show up against, it'll look dull, but also on some glossy papers, if you rub it, it'll even come off. Now, that's nothing wrong with it. The ink itself is designed for matte papers. So here we have, this is one, it's on a matte paper, and the blacks on this are really deep. It looks that even though I've got quite a lot of light here, I can see very little light reflecting off the black here. So that's a pigment black, because I've used it printed on this particular printer here. So already I've got pigment, dye, and occasionally for some printers a mix. That means that different papers perform different ways. It's part of the testing I do when I'm deciding whether I want a new paper, choose a particular type of paper, how well it works. Get it wrong, and here we have, this is printed on plain paper. This is a part of an aerial photo. I do certain specialised types of architectural photography, of verified view photography, and I need aerial photos to be able to position exactly where I had the camera. Now, this was just a screenshot captured probably off Google Maps, if I think around Google Earth. And I've printed this, but I've printed this on the Epson P5000 big printer here. I've printed it on that, but because that has a photo ink and a matte ink, and you have to physically tell it to swap them over, and it wastes ink. For printing here on ordinary A3 copier paper, I've printed this using the wrong ink. I've printed it using photo black on plain paper. And the print, it's probably, you can see it even in the video, the print looks very washed out. Doesn't matter one jot, because all I do with a print with an image like this is when I visit the scene, I actually put a mark on there where I positioned the camera. I take GPS readings as well, but it enables people to know exactly where the photo was taken. But that is an example of using the wrong ink on the wrong paper. So you do have to consider that. So we've got how many inks to use for it. I'll come back to the precise numbers and how it makes a difference in a moment. But here we've got 6 inks here. We've got the 2 blacks, and then we've got cyan, magenta, yellow, and a grey. Now, I'll come back to what the grey does in a moment, but that's quite a good range of inks. The better photo printers tend to have more inks. There's no hard and fast rule. Now, I've done another video which I'll put a link to, which looks at some details of ink numbers. I'll put that a link in the notes to this. But more inks generally better. Now, what about fewer inks? I tested a 4-ink EcoTank printer, 2650, and that has cyan, magenta, yellow dye inks, and the black is just the pigment black here. If you try and print on that printer on an art paper like this, and this is a cotton rag paper I looked at recently, it prints quite nicely. Certainly with profiles you get quite good results of it. If you try printing on photo paper, then it only, if you use a photo paper media setting, it only prints using the cyan, magenta and yellow inks. And it looks, well, pretty poor, because cyan, magenta, yellow mixed together don't give a proper black. So you don't get really dense blacks on it. It's not a photo printer. If you buy a printer that is intended as a general purpose office printer, then you may possibly be able to get reasonable looking photo prints out of it with sufficient profiling and other work on it. But equally well, you may not get very good prints on some papers. That's just because there aren't enough ink. 3 inks is not enough to be able to produce, for this technology here, is not enough to be able to produce good looking prints. They're not as bad as this one here on the plain paper, but certainly you wouldn't choose that printer for it. Now, I've got a review of that printer and several videos about it if you're curious about it, but that's an example of not enough inks. I mentioned the grey ink here. Where does that come in? Well, if you go back through the history of sort of photo printers, if I go back 20 years or so, you would get basic CMYK printers, so cyan, magenta, yellow and a black. If I look at my old Epson 1290 of years ago, that had 6 inks because it had a light magenta and a light cyan in it as well. So you've got CMYK plus 2 light colours. Now there's different approaches you can use, and here this causes confusion because there is no simple so many inks equals better than another printer with the same number of inks. It doesn't work that way. What happened is that those light inks are to save putting down very sparse amounts of the stronger colours. So if you have a grey, you can mix the grey, because remember the pictures you see are mixtures of lots of fine dots of ink. If you have a grey, you can mix a few dots of a bright strong colour, cyan, magenta, and a few dots of grey, and it will give you a sort of diluted, a lighter colour. If you only had the cyan, magenta, yellow, you would have to just put those dots quite far apart to get a light colour, and that makes it much more visible and it reduces the print quality. So if you add a grey, it enables you to, that grey plus these 3 colours allows you to mix. Now you don't need a light yellow because yellow in itself is a fairly light colour anyway, but in general the grey is there to work with the cyan and magenta and allow you not to need light cyan, light magenta. Now you might, for your printer design, decide that you're going to have light cyan, light magenta. There are going to be versions of this which will have different collections of inks in. This is partly the reason that we've got this pigment ink here. It's because this is an all-in-one printer and pigment inks work much better for documents. They happen to work much better for art papers as well, but this is primarily for documents. For photo use, we have another black here. Now, it turns out that if you use the VFA Velvet Fine Art setting on this, it uses both blacks and all the colours, so you get the best results out of that. But it needs profiling, and that can limit its usefulness to people. But sure, if you can get profiles, but if you can't get profiles, well, you're stuck with whatever you've got. So I mentioned about greys there. What about having extra colours, extra greys? Now, I've got here 2 screenshots from a couple of larger printers I reviewed. Epson P7000, which has, and here every time I have to count it, we have 10 inks, but we have to physically swap. We have to tell it to swap between photo black and matte black. So there are 2 cartridges, but only 1 set of nozzles on the print head, so you have to switch the system over. And this is off the Epson P7500, which gets rid of the black ink switching. Now this one is a 12 ink printer. What do all these extra colours do? Well, here we've got cyan, yellow, light cyan, so we've got the colour and the light version of it. We've also got a grey and a light grey, and we've got it's light black, it's listed here, and light black. So you've got 2 levels of greys. The greys, people tend to think, oh, that means it will do well for black and white. Maybe. It's not necessarily for that. It's actually all about smoothness of colour. Remember, the printer driver has to tell the printer what mix of colours to use in different places. The printer firmware also is involved in this, in deciding what the precise mix of ink coloured dots are to get whatever tone appears on your image. And that goes for any inkjet printer, and that is one thing that has steadily got better over the years in printers. They are much better at rearranging what the inks are. Now, if I have a grey, I could add extra colours. I could add extra strong colours. So in this, on the Epson P7000, I've got an orange ink and I've got a green ink. Now, the orange ink on this, I noticed when I tested the P7000, and it's also here in the P5000, does mean that if you like doing sunsets, you get some nice, good, rich colours. It's not that much of a difference. these strong colours extend the gamut or range of colours that can be produced by the printer. Mixed with the light colours, they allow for smoothness. And it works the same. Epson printers, Canon printers have their own approach to how this works. And these extra colours here, just for the strong colours, it's as much about using it commercially for proofing purposes, where you want the extra gamut, where you want the Pantone range of colours. For photo printing, and came down to the certainly P5000, P7000. When you set them up, you get a choice of installing light black or violet. Now, the violet ink, and this is the P7500. The violet ink is almost a sort of bluey. It's a very strong cyan, in some blue cyan, and it's primarily there originally to extend the gamut for proofing purposes. So if you use your P5000, 7000 for proofing, you wouldn't install the light black, you'd install the violet instead when you set the printer up. And that's a one-off thing you have to do when you set the printer up. However, people think, oh, well, I want that extra gamut. No, it makes little difference. In real life photos, it makes very little difference. So what you want is the light black. The light black gives more of a range of ink mixtures can be used, which gives smoother gradations of tone and gets rid of banding, all kinds. Now, printer profiles have their effect on this as well, but it's what the printer can produce. More inks gives the printer more options to mix different combinations of ink droplets to get the precise tonality that it wants from what you're sending to it. So we've got that. There's the 5000 and 7000 where I've got to swap the black, and the 7500 you don't have to swap the black. This one works fine with this has photo black, matte black in all the time. I noticed that this one, because it's got the extra inks, has the violet in it, and the green and the orange. So you've got all of those strong colours that extend the gamut and smoothness. And I know from testing, this large print up here was done on the P7500, particularly nice print, impressive printer. So I've got these, but I've got a grey, I've got a grey, and I've got a light grey in it as well. So I've got a mix of colours here. So what we've done is we've gone from basic printers, or very basic in case it's in the 4-colour, up to lots of colours. Now, it comes as no surprise that this costs you money. These are huge, and they're not cheap, nor are the 7000. Also, the 5000 is quite reasonable these days, but it's been around for a few years. If you want cheap, you go for these ink tank printers. But you have to realise that whatever version you get, and I'll be testing the Epson 18100, which is recently released, which has another different set of inks here, and that's a pure photo printer. It doesn't have the scanner and things like that. I'll be testing that in due course when I can get one to have a look at. But there is no simple of saying, well, these inks are better than those inks. It's all about how the inks are used. So having a grey and a red allows a particular mixture. Having light colours is one approach. This is something that unfortunately I can give you no real technical details about, because it is the kind of stuff that Epson and Canon, HP and any other printer makers is highly proprietary knowledge, and they absolutely will not tell you anything about their algorithms that translate colours into dots on that. It is a quality aspect of it, and it's one of the things that, one of their trade secrets. So you'll not get much more info on that. But in general, more inks is better, but have a look at the particular mix of inks, and importantly, as to whether the paper will work, because it's the paper coating which is the important bit here. The paper base, and obviously on this one, this is just a copy of paper, so this is just a paper. Any of the photo papers have coatings on them, and it's because these coatings vary that some papers work better for some printers. I've got some papers which look absolutely awful in the P5000, and if I put them in the P7500 they would look awful as well, no matter how well I profiled them. That doesn't tell me there's something wrong with the printer. It doesn't tell me there's something wrong with the paper. It tells me that that paper, that printer don't work together. So when you start out with manufacturer's own papers. Because if you're getting duff results off the manufacturer's own papers, then it's almost certainly your fault. If you're working with profiles and third-party papers, then if somebody's profiled it, you're probably okay there. Because remember, there are only so many paper manufacturers out there. But start simple. I did a video the other day about using test images and things like that to understand the characteristics of why every printer and every paper is slightly different. Now, you can either see that as something which is a lot of hassle, or you can see it as something that you can choose to use creatively to produce pictures that look the way you want them. I choose that route rather than that. It can be a bit of a hassle sometimes going through it, but it's one of the reasons I do the printer testing. Every single printer, even these more basic ones that I test, improves all of my printing. The more printing I do, the better I get at it. Anyway, I hope that's of some interest and it sort of clears a few things up. I put a link to another video I did a while ago about inks as well. It's got some more information on a different take on it. But if you've got any questions, please do ask, because it's people's questions that give me the inspiration for doing these short videos. And thanks for that. Oh, please do subscribe to the channel, and thanks for watching.